December 31st, 1968. A frozen runway outside Moscow. A white delta wing shape strains against the cold, engine screaming, about to make history no one in the West is allowed to see. This aircraft would fly faster than sound, faster than any airliner in history, and beat the West's most famous jet into the sky by 2 months. The West would call it Concorde Ski, a mocking nickname for what they assumed was a stolen design. The truth was far stranger and far more tragic. Within a decade, this aircraft would carry passengers past Mach 2. Within 5 years, it would fall from the sky in front of the entire world. This is the story of a machine built to prove Soviet supremacy in the sky, and the story of how ambition, speed, and secrecy collided with disaster. By the mid-1960s, 2 superpowers were racing toward a new frontier, not space this time, but speed. Supersonic passenger flight. In France and Britain, engineers were designing Concorde. In the Soviet Union, the Kremlin had a different goal: to get there first, and to prove Soviet aviation could outpace the West. The task fell to the Tupolev Design Bureau, the same institution behind the Soviet Union's heaviest bombers and its first jet airliner, the Tu-104. Leading the project was Alexei Tupolev, son of the legendary Andrei Tupolev. For him, this wasn't just an aircraft, it was a legacy to prove. On June 16, 1965, the Soviet government approved the program. The aircraft would be called the Tu-144, and it had to fly before Concorde. Designing a passenger jet to cruise at twice the speed of sound meant solving problems no civil airliner had ever faced. Engineers tested dozens of wing shapes in wind tunnels, chasing the same aerodynamic answer the French and British had already found: a slender ogival delta. The result looked strikingly similar to Concorde, so similar that Western intelligence agencies suspected Soviet spies had stolen the French design outright. Declassified files later confirmed it: Soviet intelligence had indeed obtained fragments of Concorde's design through espionage in Britain and France. But espionage alone couldn't build an airplane. The Tu-144 needed to solve problems Concorde's designers hadn't even finished solving themselves. One radical addition set the Tu-144 apart: small retractable canards near the cockpit, designed to improve control at low speed during takeoff and landing. Concorde never used canards. The Tu-144 did, a genuine Soviet engineering innovation, born from the need to land a delta-wing jet safely on shorter runways. At the heart of the aircraft sat four massive Kuznetsov Nk-144 engines, capable of pushing the jet past Mach 2, over 1,300 miles per hour. To reach those speeds, the aircraft needed afterburners for sustained cruise, a feature Concorde's engineers had specifically tried to avoid, for the sake of fuel efficiency. That single decision would haunt the aircraft's entire career, burning fuel at a staggering rate, and limiting how far it could ever fly. Inside, the cabin was built for up to 140 passengers, wrapped in a fuselage skin that would heat up from air friction at supersonic speed. That heat, combined with the demands of supersonic stress, forced engineers to use advanced heat-resistant aluminum alloys throughout the airframe. Perhaps the most striking feature was the drooping nose, hinged to tilt downward, giving pilots visibility during takeoff and landing that the raised supersonic profile denied them. At cruising speed, the nose lifted back into a needle-sharp point, sacrificing visibility entirely for aerodynamic efficiency. The cockpit itself was a maze of analog dials and switches, a pilot's workspace built for a machine that pushed human reflexes to their absolute limit. By late 1968, the first prototype was ready. The pressure was immense. Concorde's own first flight was scheduled for early the following year. On December 31, 1968, test pilot Eduard Ilyin took the Tu-144 into the sky for the first time. It flew for just 37 minutes, but it made history. The Tu-144 had beaten Concorde into the air by 2 months. Soviet newspapers celebrated it as a triumph of socialist engineering, but the celebration masked a harder truth. The prototype was still far from a finished airliner, and full of unresolved problems. On June 5, 1969, the Tu-144 became the first commercial transport aircraft to exceed the speed of sound. 11 months later, it broke Mach 2. Every milestone was a propaganda victory. But every milestone also meant pushing an unfinished aircraft harder and faster than it was ready for. Then came June 3, 1973, the Paris Air Show. The Tu-144 was about to make its first public appearance in the West, right beside its rival, Concorde. Thousands of spectators watched as the Tu-144 took off for a demonstration flight, determined to outperform Concorde in front of the world's cameras. Mid-flight, the aircraft entered a steep dive, then broke apart in the sky. All 6 crew aboard were killed, along with 8 people on the ground. The exact cause was never fully agreed upon. Theories ranged from a French Mirage fighter jet startling the crew, to a hurried maneuver to avoid collision, to structural failure. Whatever the cause, the damage was done. In front of the entire aviation world, the Soviet Union's proudest achievement had become its most public tragedy. Despite the disaster, the Soviet government pressed forward. National prestige demanded the Tu-144 enter service, whatever the cost. On December 26, 1975, the Tu-144 entered service, not with passengers, but hauling mail and cargo between Moscow and Alma-Ata. It wasn't until November 1, 1977, nearly 9 years after its first flight, that the Tu-144 finally carried paying passengers. The Moscow to Alma-Ata route covered nearly 2,000 miles, and the Tu-144 crossed it in under 2 hours, less than half the time of a conventional jet. Inside, passengers experienced a cabin louder than almost any airliner ever built. Conversation was nearly impossible without shouting. Flight attendants reportedly used handwritten notes to communicate with passengers over the deafening roar of the engines. Then, on May 23, 1978, disaster struck again. A modified Tu-144D suffered an engine fire during a test flight and crash-landed in a field, killing 2 crew members. It was the final blow. Just weeks later, Aeroflot suspended all Tu-144 passenger service permanently. In its entire career, it had flown only 55 scheduled passenger flights. Of the 16 Tu-144s built, most would never carry another passenger again. Some flew on as cargo transports. Most simply sat, waiting. The Tu-144's story might have ended there, a costly, tragic footnote. But its final chapter came from an unlikely partner, the United States. In the 1990s, NASA and Russian aerospace engineers converted a surviving Tu-144 into a flying laboratory, the Tu-144LL, to study supersonic flight for future designs. For a brief moment, the aircraft that had symbolized Cold War rivalry became a tool for Cold War cooperation. The data it produced quietly shaped decades of supersonic research, long after the Soviet Union that built it had ceased to exist. The Tu-144's true legacy wasn't commercial success, it never had any. Its legacy was proof of what happens when speed matters more than sustainability. Both the Tu-144 and Concorde eventually met the same fate, grounded not by a single disaster, but by economics that never worked. Fuel costs, deafening noise, and thunderous sonic booms made supersonic travel a luxury the world's airlines simply could not sustain. Today, a new generation of engineers is chasing the same dream: quieter, more efficient supersonic jets, using materials and computer modeling the Soviets could never have imagined. Every one of them studies the Tu-144's failures as closely as Concorde's achievements. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from what didn't work. Was the Tu-144 a triumph or a failure? The honest answer is both. It proved the Soviet Union could out-engineer the West on raw ambition alone. But ambition without patience carries a price. Rushed testing, rushed deadlines, and rushed pride cost lives, and ultimately cost the aircraft its future. Only a handful of Tu-144s remain today, scattered across museums in Russia and Germany, silent monuments to an era when speed was worth almost any price. It never made the Soviet Union rich. It never made supersonic travel practical. But for one brief moment in 1968, it made the impossible look easy. The Tu-144 didn't bankrupt an industry through failure alone, it exposed a hard truth the entire world eventually had to accept: some frontiers cost more than they're worth. And somewhere in Russia today, that first prototype still sits, quiet, grounded, and forever the first supersonic airliner to ever leave